Hello and welcome to this public parapsychology event. My name is Annalisa Ventola. I am the founder of Public Parapsychology, and I'm going to be your host this evening. I have with me James Horan and Brian Lath. Jim has a master's in clinical psychology from the University of Illinois at Springfield and a doctorate in medicine from the University of Adelaide in Australia. He serves as research director at the Integrated Knowledge Systems in the USA, as well as an editorial advisory member for the Australian Journal of Parapsychology, editorial board member of the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research, and he is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Scientific Exploration. Brian Lath is the founder director of the Institute for the Study of Religious and Anomalous Experiences, also called ISRAE. He obtained his master's and doctorate degrees in experimental psychology from the University of North Hampshire. Lath is also the lead author of Ghosted, Exploring the Haunting Reality of Paranormal Encounters, and a co-host of the new Practical Parapsychology show on the Niagara TV and radio network. Gentlemen, it's wonderful to have you with us tonight, and I'm excited to hear your lecture, so I'm going to step off the stage and let you take it away.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody, and I guess I should say boo. We're in Halloween season, although for someone that's been studying these phenomena for 30 plus years, every day is Halloween for me. So I'm going to take you through a ghost story. It's really actually a story involving ghosts, but it's also involving a discovery, a stream of consciousness, my attempt to work with other people to understand what, if anything, is real about hauntings, poltergeists, ghostly phenomena. So I call it the next gen study because, well, you're going to see in a moment. We tried to pick up where my past work left off 20 some years ago. So I don't know if everyone likes this slide, but I want to introduce my cohort tonight, Brian Lath. Hello, Brian.
Hello, everybody.
Now, this is actually more than a ghost story, actually. It's a case study. It's a story of an unlikely but a successful partnership between Brian and myself, because normally people like us would not get along. You see, I am a skeptic, and I say that as a badge of honor, not as a dirty word. I wear it as a badge of honor. I'm a sympathetic skeptic. Brian, on the other hand, is someone that is, I'm not going to say a believer, but I will say he is much more open. He's much more, what would you say, welcoming of alternative ways of thinking of things. Partly because of his experiences, partly because he's also a practitioner in different types of occult-ish science, but he's also a scientist at the end of the day. And we got together to have an adversarial collaboration. We wanted to work together to bring balance to each person's point of view and hopefully reduce each other's bias as we try to make sense of a very complex and nuanced topic. In fact, a lot of people, when they see my first title slide, they don't like it. It looks very cold, clinical, and boring. They would much rather see this. So you tell me, which do you like better? If you're like most people, this is the slide that catches your attention. And in fact, that illustration right there of that apparition standing in the middle of a cemetery, that's what caught my interest in 1976. I was a 7-year-old boy, and my parents got me a book called The Golden Book of the Mysterious. And this was a book that covered everything from the Bermuda Triangle, UFOs, Bigfoot. Out of all the different chapters that covered all sorts of unexplained phenomena, it was this chapter on ghosts that caught my attention and hasn't let go since 1976. I saw that image and I thought it was the most intriguing, beautiful thing I'd ever seen. And I wanted to know, is that real? Does this happen? And is this something that I can experience? So what you're seeing now with this slide with the illustrations, the different kind of spooky font, that's a little bit more theatrical. That's now adding trappings to this set of phenomena. And that's how most people like to engage with it. They see the TV shows, they see the movies. But today, I want to go back to the cold and the clinical. I want to strip away the trappings to get at what is real. What do we know scientifically about these things if we take away the sensationalism? Now, as I said before, this is a project that I've been on a 5+ year discovery path with Brian and also a set of other researchers that I'll talk about in a moment. But actually, this started well before. Around 2015, I I was starting to get some inquiries from colleagues because in 2001, I was a co-editor with one of my colleagues, Dr. Renzo Lang, on the first academic textbook devoted exclusively to haunting and poltergeist kind of phenomena. And I was asked, well, Jim, we're coming up on the 20th anniversary. Are you going to do a revised edition? Are you going to put out something new? And I thought about that. And, since that book has been published, I really was disappointed in the amount of research that had been done since. I thought this book would be a catalyst for new and exciting research, but actually, a lot of new research wasn't taking place. So that, in conjunction with the fact that some of the contributors to that original volume had since passed, people like Michael Persinger, Bill Roll, Ronald Finucane, Hilary Evans, those people wouldn't be part of that project if I decided to take it on. And it just didn't feel right to try to redo what I did 20 years ago. So instead of revisiting the past, I looked to the future. And I wanted to take a new path and build on what came before. What made that textbook interesting and useful and special was the fact that it didn't come from just the perspective of parapsychology. It looked at these phenomena from three particular lenses. What do we know about them from a physical standpoint? The physics, the chemistry of these experiences. What do we know about the psychology that attends these experiences? And also the socio-cultural influences. You see, all the contributors in that book were ideologically diverse, but they all realized that whatever these phenomena are, they involve a mixture of different influences and variables: the physical, the socio-cultural, the psychological. That is something that they all agreed on, even though they didn't necessarily agree that hauntings and poltergeists necessarily were paranormal in nature. So at least there was the starting ground of an interactionist model to address these phenomena. And so instead of revisiting the past and redoing the book, I decided to assemble a new team, a team that would still look at these phenomena from 3 points of view: the socio-cultural, the psychological, and the physical. But rather than bringing together diverse people that wrote on those topics individually, I wanted to put together a team, a multidisciplinary team that brought balance and perspective to each other. And I wanted this team to dive in where we left off 20 years ago, to do the research that had not yet been done. And this team, I wanted to have certain characteristics, so it was going to be fair and impactful. I wanted it to be international in scope. And sometimes there are some rival factions in the world of studying ghosts, the US-based teams and the UK-based teams. I wanted to tear down that wall and build a bridge. I wanted to be a group that was cross-disciplinary, people that had different views and brought different methodologies to the problem. I wanted it to be inclusive, meaning I wanted people to be at different points along the belief spectrum. So while Brian and I might be the polar opposites as far as him being very open and me being very skeptical, the other members of the team would sort of fill in that gap. So there would be no groupthink. We would always challenge the data and what we were interpreting from the data. And finally, everything that we would conclude and write about had to be data driven. We were focused first on model building, trying to find reliable patterns in data. Once we could identify those, then we could move to the part two, which is theory formation, making sense of those patterns. And so, even though you only have 2 members of what we call the Ghost Gang tonight, there were 3 other members: Kieran O'Keefe, Ken Drinkwater, and Neil Dagnall. Although I think everyone can agree, Brian and I, we're the most good-looking of the bunch. And actually, yes, Brian. Although you have less hair than all of us, but we'll put that aside for now. But what's also interesting is it wasn't just this core team of 5 individuals. Throughout the course of 5 years of doing a research program dedicated to exploring the socio-cultural, the psychological, and the physical aspects of these experiences, we also brought in other experts as needed, really subject matter experts in very particular areas to round out our perspectives, because we're generalists. We all have a background in parapsychology, but we also come from the world of social science from different points of view. And so even people like, public parapsychology's own Annalisa Ventola, her name is on 3 of our published work. So she's an extended member of the Ghost Gang, and we thank her for that. We also thank her for this opportunity to come and talk to you about our research, which culminated in not only a series of 25 plus peer-reviewed articles, but really what I'm most proud of is condensing all that information into an easy-to-read book, a book that is part academic and it's part applied, and it's called Ghosted. This was our COVID project. So while everyone else was staying off and doing whatever they did in lockdown, we were trying to translate all the technical information that we had in our journal articles into easy to read information and hopefully inspire new Ghost Gang members to pick up the ball and continue the research. Because we're going to talk to you about what we think we have found and what it means, but we could be wrong. We're certainly incomplete. And it's going to take a lot more research from more people with diverse perspectives and methods to finally crack the code on what is real when it comes to ghosts, hauntings, and poltergeists. So with that background, Brian, anything you'd like to add before we dive into the actual research?
Not in particular. I guess I would only maybe take issue that I'm not sure we're on the opposite ends of the spectrum anymore, Jim. I think, and I think you've said it before, we're kind of coming to a common ground where, but I would say, yes, I am a believer, and yes, you are a skeptic. But I think through all of these studies, we never really had a disagreement about the interpretation or the validity of the data itself, only necessarily maybe what it might imply. Would you agree with
That's a
that?
good point. And actually, that is going to the point of this is a story. We started off pretty much at sort of polar opposites, but over time, we certainly have come to more of the middle. And I probably would say the same of the other Ghost Gang members, that we all are probably more centrist, although we might tilt one way or not. Fair enough. But we're going to answer 4 questions tonight, or I should say we're going to take a stab at addressing 4 questions. We're certainly going to get into what we know or what we've learned in the last 5 years about the sociocultural aspects of these experiences, the psychological and the physical. But there's a 4th question that actually is going to start us all off. And that is, if we take a step back, we want to understand first, what are we even talking about? When we strip away the sensationalism, what are witnesses actually experiencing? What are they reporting? What are the signs or the symptoms that people report when they say, I've experienced a ghost? I live in a haunted house. I'm experiencing or dealing with a poltergeist outbreak. What does that actually mean in terms of the contents of the experiences, the structure of it, and are there any important nuances? Because if we can get at that, we might actually be able to define in a scientific way the phenomenology of these experiences at their core. And if you can define the phenomenology, then possibly we can measure it in a reliable way and then take research to the next level, because we will have a common definition, a common operationalization of what it means to say, I've had a ghostly episode. And the reason I use that phrase ghostly episode is because I know it's common practice, it's tradition for parapsychologists and even skeptics to talk about 3 buckets of experiences: ghosts, haunted houses, and poltergeists. And people usually think of those as 3 separate, very distinct phenomena. And I'm not convinced, because as we're going to see, the signs or symptoms of what it means to experience a ghost are also found in haunted houses, are also found in poltergeist disturbances. And actually, the structure of those experiences seems to follow a pretty predictable pattern. So from my perspective, I don't think necessarily we're dealing with 3 separate phenomena. I think we're dealing with one core phenomena that can change the way that it is expressed or experienced by people depending on the context, the setting. But I'm putting the cart before the horse. So we did first a study to understand, what do we know? We did first a literature review of the past work that's been done in surveys and case studies on what do people actually report in these different types of ghostly episodes, in addition to our own survey research. And what we found is the literature and our survey research consistently identified 28 specific signs or symptoms. I say signs or symptoms because sometimes those signs are what we call objective. They're things that we can all experience. In fact, sometimes multiple witnesses will have a similar report. They'll see a certain thing. They'll experience a certain event. and they all can agree on it. In fact, sometimes you can even document that with recording media. And sometimes you're dealing with what seems to be symptoms, meaning subjective experiences, psychological or physical in nature, that you can't always corroborate. You can't validate. It's not objective because a person can only tell you what their personal experience was. So we found that there were these 28 consistent signs or symptoms, and they generally referred either to subjective events, or what we call psychological perceptions, things like human forms that only one person saw, or mysterious odors, the sense of being watched, or that there was a unseen presence in the room, emotional feelings that came out of nowhere, or bodily sensations, feeling nauseous or off balance. But those are different, you would think, than objective events. Things like object displacements, electrical disturbances, audio-visual anomalies that you can show and share, bodily injuries that even though they might happen to a person, you can see, I was scratched, I was bit, or things like mysterious fires, things that clearly happened in the physical world that could be corroborated. So 28 consistent signs or symptoms. They seem to follow in two general buckets, the subjective and the objective. And those still S and O phenomena you see consistently across ghost experiences, hauntings, and poltergeists. So the same set of experiences, core phenomena, seem to define these separate types of episodes. That's why we call these ghostly episodes, because most people give it a spiritual, a paranormal, a ghostly interpretation. But when you apply some math to those cases, something interesting happens. You see, most people think of things like questionnaire or survey research, social science research is not very sophisticated. That all you usually can do is look for patterns, linguistic trends, but there's not really much math you can apply. And that's actually not true. There's a whole science called psychometrics, which is the reliability and validity that goes into surveys and questionnaires. But it also goes into how you can analyze the contents of witness reports. Because you can start coding witness reports, giving numbers to different themes, the presence or the absence of certain signs or symptoms. You can code for certain variables. Was the person a man or woman, young or old? Did it happen individually or in a group? You can put a mathematical template to almost any witness report. And when you do that, something very interesting happens. Now, we're going to use not just normal mathematics, we're going to use the most advanced psychometrics that we have. There is a form called modern test theory. This is mostly used in educational psychology when you have to do reading, math, and science exams. These accreditation and achievement tests that are used to gauge how well students are learning. And you have to be able to compare those learnings to last year's and the year before. Oh, and you also have to make sure that those tests that you're gauging reading, math, and science ability are not biased, because every year parents sue over the results of those educational tests. So you have to be able to show in a court of law that they're reliable, they're valid, and they're not biased, that the answers that you get are not artificially skewed because of a student's age or their gender or where they might live. So these are very advanced mathematics, and they're the mathematics that are used in assessments that might sound familiar to you. The ASAT, the ACT, the GRE, the MCAT, the LSAT. These well-known accreditation tests all use modern test theory. It's very difficult to do, and there's probably only about maybe 10 to 15 experts in the world. Luckily, my co-editor from the first book from 2001, that textbook, Renzo Lang, is one of those experts. So when we apply modern test theory, in a particular form of it called Rasch scaling, named after a Danish mathematician, George Rasch, we found out that actually there are not two sets of experiences, that there's not one subjective category and objective category, and those are two distinct states, two distinct types of categories. No, there's one. There's one category of experience that forms a continuum, and the subjective and the objective form one factor, not two. And that actually surprised everybody. But it gets even more interesting because they're not just along a continuum. Oh, there's a continuum, but that continuum is actually stacked ranked. In other words, these experiences are probabilistic. the individual perceptions, the signs or symptoms that people talk about of what it means to experience a ghost or live in a haunted house or have a poltergeist outbreak, those individual subjective and objective events actually form a hierarchy. Some experiences are very common, some are more rare, and some are only seen in rare cases, the most intense episodes. There is a predictable hierarchy, a ladder, if you will, of these events. So not only are they consistent across different ghostly episodes, there's only one factor, and that factor is very predictable. It's predictable irrespective of the kind of ghostly episode or the age and gender of the witness. So whatever is being reported is actually systematic, and it's very predictable. And as we're going to see, it's not just the events that are predictable, but who has the experiences is also a very predictable thing. So the results are very interesting because we get this rank stacked effect, this hierarchy of ghost experiences, what we call the haunt hierarchy, not only from survey research, but if you code witness accounts from real-time case studies, you get the same effect. So it's not an artifact of just doing survey research. We also get this when people report experiences in real time. So there is a haunt hierarchy that is robust, irrespective of who the witness is, their age or their gender. And the internal structure, however, that stacking, that sequence of events is pretty robust, generally speaking. But if I alter the setting in which it happens, in which that experience manifests, the systems stay put, they're still there, but now you start seeing shifts in what's reported and at what point. And what we found is when you look at experiences that are spontaneous, the witnesses weren't looking for something to happen, they didn't necessarily want something paranormal to happen, but the experience happened naturally, organically, then you get a particular haunt hierarchy that works very well. But if I ask people for their experiences and I map it and I do those same mathematics, but they're under a circumstance where they were on a ghost tour, paranormal tour and escapade, well then the same sets of symptoms are there, but the order changes. If a person is a entrepreneur, someone that makes their living off basically being in the paranormal business, the hierarchy shifts. If it's a person that hasn't been on a ghost tour, they haven't had a paranormal experience, they're just going to imagine what it might be like based on them reading a book, seeing a TV show, watching a movie, but they're imagining what probably happens and how it unfolds. The sequence changes. And if someone is trying to fool you, let's say that you ask them, hey, you want to be on a paranormal TV show? Convince me. Give me your best case that you've ever experienced, your most dramatic sighting. And you have someone try to fool you by giving you a fake account, you'll still get the same set of signs and symptoms, but the order of those shifts. So there is actually a haunt hierarchy that is natural, that is spontaneous, that is quite different than these other symptoms, these other settings, these other contextual variables. So whatever is going on in the natural world when these experiences are happening organically, not through paranormal tourism or ghost hunts or fraud or someone's imagination, but just naturally unfolding, there's something systematic going on that's very robust and very consistent. And we can use that as a thermometer, a diagnostic test to tell when someone's expression, their account matches a natural, sincere ghostly episode or maybe an artifact. So we're not dealing with two separate accounts. We're dealing with a thermometer. So that model you see on the right-hand side, that's how the signs and symptoms work. There are some that are very common that indicate a low-level haunt, some a medium, and some you're only going to see at the high end of the scale, the most extreme cases. But now we know a pattern that can distinguish not only low, medium, and high. We can also tell you if a person's account most likely aligns to a spontaneous case, or is it probably due to an artifact of a different kind of setting? Anything you would add, Brian?
I just want to add kind of a key point to the amazingness that is the SSE in terms of, excuse me a second. The point here is that in different environmental situations, and I think this is a key finding of using the SSE and us creating the scale, it remains a unidimensional structure. Those S and O events are always intertwined in a single factor across all of those conditions. But yet, what we find is depending on the group that we're assessing and the context of the experience they're reporting, as Jim said, right, we will see items shift and become less or more probable, but always maintaining this unidimensional structure. So, I like to refer to it, and Jim, you'll probably say it later, a backbone of high strangeness. The probability of individual occurrences will shift as a function of the context, but remains a unidimensional predictive structure that you can compare against other types of environments, right? Other types of people reporting. So, spontaneous groups are going to show a certain probability structure that's unidimensional. And then, the imagined or fantasy derived group is going to also show a unidimensional structure, but some of those items shift. So it's a flexible scale, but it always has shown us this unidimensional structure that is consistent with an intermingling of objective and subjective events.
No, that's right. And what Brian's talking about, the SSE, is the name of the questionnaire, the actual research tool that we devised. And now we have a standardized scoring method for it. It's called the Survey of Strange Events, or SSE for short. Now you're going to notice I'm not showing you what those 28 items, those 28 signs or symptoms are. And in fact, given some nuances of some of those signs or symptoms, the checklist that you're going to score actually is 32 items. But there's a reason I'm not going to show you those items and I'm not going to show you the scoring. And that's because of test security. In other words, you don't want that information just to be public knowledge. Okay, that is scientific knowledge that if that would ever got out, well, then people that are trying to deceive you, they would be armed with that knowledge of now knowing how to adjust their account to get by that check. So I'm going to encourage everyone to look at our journal articles, and you're going to see them under reference sections throughout the different slides. And at the very end, I'm going to show you where you can get copies of everything. And I encourage you to look at the scientific papers. But basically, we have a survey measure that works the same way as a physics instrument to weigh things, or a thermometer to measure the intensity of things. So it is a standardized scale to know just how intense a haunting is. And depending on the pattern, the sequence of events, most likely what is its source. Now, the 32 item checklist, by the way, let me just give this information because I'm proud of it. There is a lot of psychometric support for this instrument. It's not just a checklist that is the same as a quiz you might come across in a magazine. This is a scientific instrument. It has very strong internal reliability. There are rash scores. So in other words, we can score a witness's account, or we can score a case using multiple witnesses' testimony. And now we can start doing comparisons between witnesses and comparisons between cases. Higher scores on the survey of strange events show stronger perceptual intensity. And also, as I said, the phenomenology of a spontaneous account is quite different than those from different control settings. So ghostly episodes comprise a very predictably structured core phenomena. And I call it an encounter phenomena because those different signs or symptoms, they're actually a collection of different encounter experiences. And surprisingly, they also involve other kinds of entities besides just traditional ghosts. Things like seeing evil spirits, sensing different kinds of presences, the presence of elves or little people. You will see different types of entities within the context of a ghostly episode. So there was a hypothesis by Hilary Evans and a few other researchers a long time ago that what you know as an alien abduction or an encounter with an angel or a mix up with a devil or spirits, other kinds of folklore beings, that maybe all of those are the same phenomena that just look different given the background of the witness. There's actually some evidence for that. So, but the fact is the sequence of events changes given the setting. That gets us into sociocultural issues. So actually, subjective objective events, SO anomalies, don't occur in a vacuum. The interpretation and the report of these anomalies occurs in ecosystem of very powerful context. It's not a sterilized Petri dish. Okay, you have a person's the immediate setting or the situation that they're in. You have the social group that might be with them or the one that they hang out with that also can exert some peer pressures, good or bad. You have the fact that they might have a certain paranormal religious ideology that they've grown up with. And also, these experiences are happening within a larger culture, and there's different cultural interpretations of these kinds of events. So we're finding that witnesses are not some sort of passive observers. It's not like watching a car accident and everyone agrees on what happened and in what order, but rather witness is the wrong word. They're active participants in the construction of their experiences, whether they realize that or not. They are actors in creating a scene. So this implies that ghostly episodes, when you hear someone's report, it's not a clean, sterilized account. It's really a narrative construction. It's partly what happened to them, but it's also partly them that they're bringing to that equation. And actually, we did another research study to understand exactly how this works. And it's interesting because when you look at how popular, how prevalent, and how powerful ghost narratives are, not just in the world of research and science and TV shows, but just in pop culture, just how it is historically, we found when you look at all the sociocultural materials, it really boils down to 5 key things that really create an allure. Why are people drawn to these stories and how do they become so engrossed in them? And why is it that these ghost experiences actually act as immersive experiences? Because even if you're watching a TV show or you're hearing a ghost story, you also are not a passive observer. You also are now putting some of yourself in the interpretation of that event, and you're probably going to engage that person and start asking questions. So in a way, you're starting to mold that person's account. You're starting to add a little bit of yourself into that narrative as well. So narratives are never fixed in time. They evolve over time, and there's 5 key variables that explain this. We call it the VAPIS model. That's an acronym for 5 key variables that explain the dynamics of what's going on when somebody encodes a ghostly episode that they've experienced and when they're relaying it to somebody else. And then this also applies to someone's response to that reporting. So VAPIS is an acronym, and the V stands for versatile. Ghost narratives are extremely flexible. They can represent a cross-section of moods, locations, and themes. This is why Hollywood uses ghost stories to tell all sorts of stories, from drama, romance, or comedies. It's a story, it's a theme that works really well no matter what the audience and no matter the kind of story you're telling. They're also very adaptable. These are the kinds of stories that can change over time to match social changes. The way that the Romans thought of ghosts is not how they were thought of in medieval times, and it's not the way that we necessarily think of it today. Yet ghost stories are not just versatile in the moment, they're adaptable over time, and they can flex and morph in addition to societal changes. And they're also very participatory. They invite people to just get involved, whether we're talking about one person or a group. So ghost narratives engage people at a way that is very scalable. So a person, a group, an entire team, or an entire society can participate in these types of experiences. And they're universal. These are the kinds of narratives that appeal to people regardless of their backgrounds. So these narratives are the same as an immersive experience. And it's hard to just listen to a conversation like we are about the science of ghosts or someone's account of a ghost or what you see on TV or read in a book or might find online. You can't just be a passive observer. You will always be drawn in because they are so engaging. And the VAPIS model explains why they're so engaging. And because they're so engaging, they're very dangerous. You need to understand that if you're going to investigate ghostly episodes, either casually or very scientifically, it is a contact sport. You will never be a passive person. You will always be involved. And that means that when you are gathering data and when you're trying to make sense of other people's data, you need to understand that those narratives, okay, were constructed. You're not getting clean accounts. There's wrapping around that. And because of that, the narratives are vulnerable to gaslighting effects, positive or negative. In other words, the way that a person remembers an event, the way that they will tell the event, can either get more paranormal or less paranormal, depending on the influences and the audience they're speaking to. The narratives are very mimetic. They're contagious. We know this. You can even just demonstrate this scientifically, almost like a physics experiment, that when one person has an experience, that primes the person listening to it to also have an experience. Or if someone is coming at it very skeptically, that can also prime someone to be more skeptical. So these narratives, they're vulnerable to positive and negative gaslighting, and they're also contagious, just like an infectious disease. It also means that these narratives are territorial, that they're inherently divisive. Even though all sorts of people will be drawn to these narratives, the fact is these bring out the skeptic or the advocate in people. This drives wedges between experimental parapsychologists and amateur ghost hunters. People have very firm beliefs and ideologies about what these narratives represent. And now we get out of science and now we get into the world of ideology and belief. We all have them. I do. Brian does. And it's hard to separate sometimes belief from science. And when you're talking about these narratives, there's something very polarizing about them, in addition to being very engaging. And finally, these narratives, this haunt hierarchy, and these sequence of events happen in also non-paranormal contexts. You like to think that ghosts, haunted houses, and poltergeists refer to only paranormal kinds of events. But we know that the same haunt hierarchy happens in cases of childhood imaginary friends, especially imaginary friends that are called the deep friends, meaning they seem to have a character and a will of their own. They happen also in another form of phenomena called group or gang stalking, where people feel as if they're being followed and monitored by covert groups, whether they are government agencies or maybe a past romantic partner or other unknown people that are tracking them, monitoring their every movement. So the same accounts, the same raw ingredients that goes into gang and group stalking looks just like a haunt, only not in a paranormal context. So a paranormal interpretation speaks to the narrative, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that is the catalyst or the cause of what's going on. So we know that there are a core set of events that happen in a very predictable way unless you change the setting, and then you get very predictable shifts in the phenomenology. And we know what some of those variables are that will shift the phenomenology, those variables that go into VAPIS, those different sociocultural influences. But we also know that there's something about the person that's having the experience, because what people are reporting is not random. The order in which they experience things is not random. And who has these experiences is not random. There's been a conundrum that's been well known in parapsychology for decades. And that is this question of, why do some people have ghostly experiences and others don't? And I don't just mean in just daily life, but I mean, you could have 2, 3, 5 people in a haunted house, and some of them will experience something in the moment and other ones don't. Why is that? What is different about people that can have these ghostly experiences versus the people that don't? Well, we call the people that have these ghostly experiences, especially that consistently have them over time, not just one shots, but people that have them over the course of their lives, we call them haunters. And we did research looking again at case research, case studies, spontaneous cases, as well as prior survey research and doing new survey research. And we looked and found that, you know what, out of all of the research that's been done, parapsychologists have done a pretty good job at looking at certain individual differences in characteristics. In fact, you're going to see a list of different variables that people have tested over time, but no one ever tested them all at once. So we did. We did a large survey study to get a group of haunters, people that had experiences, whether it's ghosts, haunted houses, or poltergeists over time, people that routinely have these experiences versus people that never have them. And we administered psychological measures that got at these variables. And we wanted to know which of these, if any, separated, characterized the group of haunters versus the people that never have the experiences. And out of all those characteristics, only two mattered. Only two consistently separated who has the experiences and who don't. And those are transliminality and paranormal belief. And of the two, paranormal belief is secondary, transliminality is primary. Now, transliminality is a perceptual personality variable. There's nothing necessarily paranormal about it. It has other names. One is called the boundary construct or mental boundaries. It's also known as sensory processing sensitivity. But it really refers to a person's level of, well, sensitivity. Sensitivity to the environment, both the external environment, what's happening in their physical environment, as well as what's happening in their internal experience. So these people, in a way, are sort of like superheroes. They're super sensitive. They're more sensitive to lighting levels, to noises, also to the way that rooms are laid out and the colors and the schemes. So they're very sensitive to the outside world. At the same time, they're very sensitive to what's happening inside their bodies and changes to what's happening inside their bodies. So people that are higher on transliminality, super sensitivity, combined with a belief system that gives context to those transliminal experiences, that seems to be the winning formula. It's very robust, it's very replicable, and we've shown this not only in survey research, but also real-time studies. When you bring in groups of people that high transliminals, high paranormal belief versus low transliminals and low paranormal belief. And you know what? You get this effect in real time. It's so consistent, it's almost like a physics demonstration. So we know these two variables matter. Maybe other ones do. Maybe other variables do matter. But this notion of sensitivity with an openness and a framework to make sense of anomalous experiences seems to be the winning formula. But now oftentimes I get people push back on that and say, wait a minute, Jim, I'm not like you. I think that there's another group of haunters that's not like your group that you just described. Because I don't think poltergeists are the same thing as a haunted house or people that see just ghostly experiences or encounter experiences. I think poltergeists are something quite different. And they're a separate kind of haunter. And I don't know that transliminality really has much of anything to do with that. Fair enough. So we looked at that too. We looked in the literature to see what, if any, good psychological testing studies have been done on poltergeist focus persons. Now, one thing we know about poltergeist cases from many years of research is that the weird events, whether they're subjective or objective, tend to focus around the presence of a certain living person. We call them a focus person or an RSPK agent. RSPK from William Roll means recurrent, spontaneous psychokinesis. His idea was that, yes, poltergeists are a kind of haunted house, but they're not due to things like deceased spirits or evil spirits. What it seems to be is a living person that has psychokinetic abilities, and without realizing it, because of maybe irritability or certain mood states, they're releasing this pent-up energy and it's affecting the environment. They don't even know that they're doing it. It's led to a very popular notion known as the Carrie myth. This idea that young repressed teenagers, specifically females, they're the cause of all this psychokinetic ability. And poltergeist cases really come down to repressed teenagers. And if everyone's ever seen the Stephen King movie or the novel Carrie, that's where the Carrie myth comes from. But when you look at the literature on this, there's actually been very few good studies done where they've used psychological testing to understand the mental state of an apparent focus person in cases. First, poltergeist cases that are good are rare to begin with, let alone to catch one when it's active, let alone to come in and be allowed to do research, especially sensitive testing. But when you do look at the cases that have been done, and there have only been really a handful, good psychological testing cases, you realize that this idea of a very troubled teenager, repressed, going through clinical problems, almost psychopathology, doesn't seem to make much sense. That Carrie myth is really more of a myth. It's more of a meme than a scientific principle because we don't see psychopathology. If anything, the testing is showing us that there are really 10 different variables that seem to be in play with a focused person, an agent. These people seem to be very high in imagination, magical thinking, or fantasy proneness. They seem to have a rebellious attitude, very impulsive, aggressive, hostile. They seem to have a lot of somatic complaints. They're anxious. They have this irritability to them. They tend to have lower self-esteem, self-concept. In other words, poor ego weakness. They also tend to be generally unhappy, shame-based, or jealous. They also seem to have dissociative tendencies, and there also seems to be hints of we call temporal lobe lability, where their temporal lobe in their brain, that seat of fantasy and emotion, can be very easily triggered, either through emotional states or maybe even physical stimuli like electromagnetic fields. And these people also tend to score higher on measures of introversion. So it doesn't seem to be psychopathology. It seems to be these other psychological states. And there's something interesting about those psychological states. They all correlate positively with transliminality. 7 of those 8 concepts show positive and low to moderate correlations with transliminality. So again, I would argue that, wait a minute, it's not psychopathology, it's not the age of the focused person, it's not the gender of the focused person. Really, it's transliminality. I think this is a good way to look at the thread that's connecting these 8 characteristics. And so instead of psychopathology, I call it a transliminal dis-ease model. It's not that like these people are going through psychological trauma or stress. They might be, but they also could be going through lower level stress where they're simply at a state of dis-ease. Their normal state of ease and balance is disrupted gradually or maybe abruptly. But it seems to be a highly transliminal person in a situation of dis-ease, not necessarily at pathological levels, but just being in that state of irritability and imbalance. That seems to be, from my point of view, what's separating RSPK agents, those focused persons, from other individuals. So, from our standpoint, we're still finding evidence that's consistent with the transliminal model for ghostly episodes, even if you think poltergeists are something separate. Anything you would add to that, Brian?
No, it's just I might use the word subclinical, right? So we're looking at all of these maybe subclinical tendencies that we can measure. Yet looking at all of them, we see that common theme of transliminality, and of course we see it within hauntings. So again, we're looking at a continuum, and if we're really honest about the few poltergeist cases that have been investigated in detail. William Roll's famous interpretation that it's an RSPK agent is a good theory, but notably not an absolute theory. Because we cannot, if you believe in putative psi, right, we don't have a direct measurement mechanism of it. But we do see in these studies, right, that we've conducted, that there's this underlying theme of transliminality and subclinical states across the board of both haunting, poltergeists, and haunted houses. So yeah, I mean, just kind of emphasizing that the underlying theme is constant. Only the severity and nature, and maybe in some cases interpretation, is what is actually changing.
Excellent. So look, we've reviewed sociocultural variables, some psychology. Now we're going to look at physical factors. Because let's face it, when everyone thinks of ghosts, they think of ghost hunters. And when people think of ghost hunters, they think of people walking around with different kinds of meters, like electromagnetic field meters, infrasound detectors, tape recorders, video cameras. You think physical equipment. And so we wanted to look at the research on, well, what has science found out about any correlates? What do we know about the environments that are supposedly haunted, just from the standpoint of technology, from environmental measures? They're very popular. I know they've been sensationalized, but believe it or not, there is actually a very vast active literature in this area. There have actually been a lot of studies throughout the years where parapsychologists and also some mainstream researchers have brought in physical instruments, used them correctly, and tried to see if there's difference between haunted environments and non-haunted environments. So we wanted to look at that literature and find out, well, since that first book from 2001, what do we know from environmental science about these experiences? Because actually, mainstream scientists have been looking at haunted houses for years, even though they don't even know it. You can go to any database, whether it's Google Scholar or ResearchGate, Scopus or PsycInfo, and type in these phrases: sick building syndrome, mass psychogenic illness, place identity and attachment, the evolutionary nature of creepiness, extraordinary architectural experiences, sacred or enchanted spaces. Because when you look at the signs or symptoms that go along with those mainstream psychological concepts, guess what? Those 28 signs or symptoms apply there too. So even if mainstream researchers don't know that they're doing parapsychology, they are. So we wanted to know, looking at all of the literature, not just in parapsychology, but looking at all of the literature that we have in environmental psychology from these other points of view, what do we know about these experiences? And here's what we found out. Oops. So first off, contrary to common assumptions, even though people have been using technical equipment for years and years and years, there's actually a lack of good, solid research in this domain. You would think by now that using different meters, technological instruments, environmental science, that would have been done to death. Actually not. It is a green field of research because there has been very little research done in any good systematic way. Of the studies that have been done, most of them have looked at or have concluded that there are 6 ambient variables that are important. First, the notion of embedded cues, meaning when you look at the environment of a haunted house, its design, the color, the interior design, the layout, we call gestalt effects. The embedded cues can sometimes seem to matter. For example, a person might feel like they're being watched in a parlor in a Victorian mansion. Well, you might find that parlor in the Victorian mansion is full of old portraits where people are literally being watched. They may not even realize that there are these embedded cues that they're being picked up on, especially for high transliminals. But embedded cues are an environmental cueing system, right? So that is an influence that potentially could matter. The lighting level of environments is another one. The air quality, what we breathe, because how much oxygen we're getting, the level of contaminants, the type of pollutants, that can affect our psychology as well. The temperature, the actual physically measured temperature of environments. Infrasound, a hum you can't hear. Very low frequencies that basically cause tremors. People can pick this up even though they may not realize it's in certain environments, and it can happen naturally, as well as electromagnetic fields. So out of all the environmental research that's been done, these 6 ambient variables are the ones that researchers have honed in the most. The problem is there's been very, very little consistency. The items that I've marked there, not in white, but out there, that they're inconsistent, they're weak. So sometimes you might find that some of these variables matter. Sometimes you might find they never seem to matter. And sometimes, yes, you seem sometimes across cases, but not always. So in other words, we're no closer to the mystery. Sometimes some environmental variables seem to matter, sometimes not. So when you look at the research on physical variables, we need more studies using new instruments, different types of instruments, new research designs. So in our article, which by the way, we reviewed all the environmental science, that was on, we published that in the Frontiers in Psychology journal. It's an open access journal, and I encourage everyone to go see it. The reference is here down below, because that article has gotten more mainstream attention than a lot of other parapsychology articles that you will see on Frontiers. In fact, that article has 97% more views than any other article in Frontiers in Psychology. And we get more requests from people in the biomedical sciences and the environmental sciences for that paper than other stuff. So if anyone ever tells you that, oh, looking at ghosts, looking at haunted houses, trying to bring some scientific rigor to this, that's not going to be appreciated. People are going to shut you down. No one is interested. It is a taboo topic. BS. There is a tremendous amount of interest in this. The fact is, there needs to be more research. We need more consistent research using more precise measurements of all these ambient variables and other ones. We need to be measuring the individual differences of witnesses. We know they're high transliminals. We know they're stronger in paranormal belief, but we also need to get at their attention and their perceptual sensitivities to different types of environmental stimuli. We might find that high transliminals are really good at picking up certain things, but not others. So we need precision. We also need to get a better handle on what we call gestalt effects. In other words, the layout, the design, the color scheme, the spatial syntax of these environments. And we know there are certain variables that go into the spatial mapping of these environments, whether they happen inside or outside. And we've only scratched the surface. So there is a lot of just normal psychology and normal physics that we have to apply to this before we even touch parapsychology. It is a green field. It is a blue ocean of research. And surprisingly, it hasn't happened yet. So you can see why we need your help. But there is something really freaky here. And I know we're running low on time, so Brian, I want you to be succinct, but we do know that electromagnetic fields are one of the most sensationalized effects. They're always talked about on TV, but usually they're used by people that don't know what they're doing or knowing how to interpret the data. So I think they're one of the most misunderstood aspects of ghost hunting or field research. But we have done some studies where we have documented something with EMF that is very freaky. It hasn't been picked up yet. No one has really picked up the ball and ran with it. But Brian, give people a little taste of what we're learning here.
Sure. So basically, guys, over 3 studies, 2013, 2017, and 2019, I basically set up quasi lab, the best lab scenario sort of environment that I could in with 2 of the studies, what were known to be quote unquote haunted houses, right? Where, over a 10-year history, I had in controlled conditions actually documented some pretty cool phenomena and basically had run out of alternative explanations to explain what was going on. In a nutshell, what we have found is that there is, in fact, a relationship between EMF and objective and or subjective phenomena. The thing is that it's not the increase in magnitude. It is a variability effect. So basically, the only way individuals, in other words, none of the people on ghost hunting shows, et cetera, who have handheld meters would probably be able to detect this effect. But in controlled conditions, we've been able to show increases or decreases in the variability of EMF right before or during controlled incidences of either like shadow people, very clear voices on audio recorders where other environmental recorders show there's no ambient environmental noise. And most recently, 12 PK trigger objects, beach balls, right, that were at the Whispers that on their own moved off of a bedstand after we had controlled and examined for any alternative causes 12 times in an hour and 10 minutes. And when we look at that data with those beach balls moving on their own, right, PK, we always found this suppression, right, either directly before or during, right, the movement of the beach balls. Same thing with the previous study in 2013. Although with the study in 2019, we were also able to show that a control meter, a data logging EMF meter, 3-axis, about 15 feet away in another room, did not show any of the variability we were seeing in the target room where the beach balls were moving, suggesting, right? And actually, the 2013 studies showed this as well because we were seeing massive changes in the correlations between electromagnetic fields on an hour to hour basis with static meters in a house with absolutely no electricity generating power. Right. So we're talking correlation shifts of 0.5 to 0.6 on an hour to hour basis in 2013. And here in 2019, we see that the fields are changing in the room where the beach balls are moving. Right. We're seeing this variability effect, but we're seeing none of that at all in the control meter 15 feet away, which is suggestive. I'm not saying it proves, but certainly is suggestive of spontaneously generating electromagnetic fields, which most physicists would tell you can't happen. And maybe they can't. Maybe there is an alternate explanation for this. But we, basically tried to look for alternative explanations the best of our ability, including hitting the bedboard, jumping up and down on the bed, vents, wires, are the trigger objects rigged, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we applied the same sort of rigor to the 2013 study. So we are left with a mystery at this point, where EMF
Yes.
does, wiggles. EMF seems to wiggle in association with objective events. And by the way, subjective events too, because our seance study showed compression and expansion in EMF meters when people would report subjective phenomena they were experiencing in a laboratory seance. And they, of course, had no access to the EMF meters of the readings. So fairly strong correlation there too.
So what we wanted to do after 5 years of research, looking at sociocultural variables, psychological and physical, we wanted to stitch it all together and produce a grounded theory of what we think was happening in ghostly episodes, at least as far as we could tell. So we then stitched everything together, trying to create a theory. What is happening? And that theory we came up with is haunted people syndrome, or HPS. I like to say that haunted people syndrome is my idea. That was a term we coined, but it isn't. There's actually an old book by two parapsychologists that used the phrase haunted people, and it was a good one. It was referring to poltergeist cases, but actually we know that these phenomena tend to happen predictably to certain people. And so we want to understand the context, the setting, and the implications of that. At the end of the day, we think haunted people syndrome so far is a good working model to make sense of ghostly episodes. It's not a complete theory. It may be entirely wrong, but let's explain what this means. Because at the end of the day, we think that haunted people syndrome is a phenomena between the crossroads of belief and boundary structures. In other words, it's an interactionist phenomena. It's not going to happen just any place or to just any person. It takes the right person in the right setting for you to get a ghostly episode. So here's what we think happens. First, you need high transliminality. Now, even someone that is average or below average transliminality, we can influence that a little bit and make it rise. But the people that are naturally high transliminal, those are the people where all the dice are loaded for them to become haunted. It is the foundation for anomalous experiences. So people that have high transliminality, they can't help it. They are hardwired to have anomalous experiences. And specifically, those 28 signs or symptoms. And they're going to have them in a particular order. That person's going to want to make sense of those. That's where paranormal belief comes in. It's a worldview that gives them a way to make sense of, to make a narrative construction of why did those experiences happen? Why are they happening to me? Why are they happening now? And they're not just happening at any time. They're happening under situations where there's dissonance. In other words, dis-ease states are actually amplifying the transliminality. Let's face it, you can put someone that's highly transliminal into a very cold clinical room, and they might be sensitive to the lights or the temperature. But if you put them into a high stimulus environment, that's when you're going to actually ramp up the anomalous experiences. It's like turning the faucet on at full blast. So you put someone high transliminal in a situation of dis-ease, and now you're actually amplifying, ramping up the transliminal experiences. You're also causing something to happen, because once somebody notices one thing and they have a story they're telling themselves to make sense of it, people will then try to find confirmation of that story. Then you start getting observer bias, confirmation bias. They'll now start noticing every other weird event in the environment, giving it an interpretation that's consistent with the story that they have. They might even start infecting other people around them through suggestion or expectancy effects. We know this in the biomedical world. They've been studying placebo effects forever. So you don't have to be highly transliminal to be infected through suggestion. It certainly makes you more vulnerable, but we know that there are psychological contagion effects because of the timing of the experiences. We have done research looking at the temporal patterns in poltergeist episodes and haunting cases. You don't always get quality data looking at the timing of events, but when you do have it, what do you see? You see a mathematics that aligns to an infectious disease and the outbreak of a contagion effect. It starts slow, it starts snowballing, and then it eventually tapers off. But there is a flurry of activities that looks just like a psychological or a biomedical contagion effect. The interpretation that people give almost always aligns to their belief system, to their biopsychosocial context. If someone is highly religious, they're going to give it a religious interpretation. If they're coming from a more folklore or cultish angle, they're going to adjust their interpretation. And by the way, these experiences really freak people out the more personal they become. When you look at the anxiety that's provoked in people that are having these experiences, the haunted people, they're going to have more anxiety the more intense those experiences get psychometrically. So, in other words, higher anxiety for the signs or symptoms at the top of the thermometer. And the more that they get in their personal space, the more that the experiences are in their inner circle versus outside of their personal space, that predicts the anxiety level. So it's a threat response that people are having. It's not just the experiences are spooky, it's the fact that people are feeling threatened by them the closer the experiences happen to them. That's what we think is happening with haunted people syndrome. Now, that does not mean, however, that other variables can't come into play. In fact, we're asked all the time, are you saying there's nothing paranormal to ghostly episodes? That's not what I'm saying at all. Okay? Our model of haunted people syndrome works with or without the paranormal. We think that there is a psychological and a physical phenomena that is happening irrespective of anything paranormal. Okay? I think what I just described for you, the mechanics, that phenomenology, is happening regardless of anything paranormal. But we also know that high scoring people that score high on transliminality, not only are they more sensitive to things like suggestions and environmental effects, they also score higher on tests of psi. So maybe, just maybe, people that are highly transliminal and are having ghostly episodes, maybe they really are sensing something that other people don't, or they're manifesting something in addition to normal psychology, normal physics, normal sociology. So I don't know, but that's what keeps me excited. And I know we've gone over, and I appreciate everyone's patience if we've gone through this, because this can get kind of technical, but we're talking about our theory. It's not only in our book, Ghosted, which I encourage everyone to get, because it's so much more articulate than I've been tonight, and it goes into a lot of detail, and it also tells you how you can help. Because the first part of the book talks about haunted people syndrome, how we arrived at that theory. The last half of the book tells how you can help as citizen scientists or professional psychologists, and how you can help us do research in the field in a way that we can get data at a way that we can't through normal means. And we have a new podcast called Practical Parapsychology we hope you tune into, where we talk about those methodologies, those theories, and those research designs. And we hope to bring in a new generation to this field. It's exciting, it's underserved, and who knows what we're going to find. So Annalise, with that, I will pass it back to you. I'm sorry for going over. I can get winded. I love this stuff.
I couldn't shut it down. That was too good of a talk. I'm so glad that we recorded this. You know, I've participated in some research with both of you, but having this overview was great even for me. Even after having read your book, I think you put a lot of things very well and very I would say lay friendly terms, and I appreciate that a lot. This is a good time. We have run over, but I would still like to do a little bit of Q&A. And so I'm inviting people to put questions in their Q&A box. And again, if I know you and you want to raise your hand, I might invite you to the stage to ask your questions directly. But in the meantime, I'm wondering if perhaps one or both of you could say a little bit more about what kind of opportunities there might be for citizen scientists who are interested in participating in this research.
Okay, well, we are working on several projects because basically Jim and I go back and forth on creating tech and trying to get it out there versus trying to implement it successfully and get people involved in it. So previously I had the Roundtable of Citizen Scientists, and we had to do a hiatus on that because Mesa 3 had a coding glitch, which took and it just came back online. Some of the features were still usable. In fact, we used it in our June study, Jim. but now it's back up to all four modes are working correctly. So, really right now we're transitioning through practical parapsychology, where we're doing a weekly podcast oriented towards, giving more information to lay people. People that are interested in ghost hunting, and we're trying to devise further ways for like standardizing interview scales. We have basically, through doing the study in June, developed a standardized ESP app, which uses the four elemental symbols that can be taken on a phone or a tablet, right? So you don't have to go into the laboratory, with appropriate questions for focus, right? And belief about how successful you'll be, and information that you can give in the app about where you are, how crowded is it, what is your mood like? Because Jim and I think, both very much believe that the action should be back out in the field. We need to move more away from laboratories and sterilizing the human experience, and instead take more of a sociocultural approach, where we measure, right, all of that dirty test tube stuff as much as we can, but get better measurements of potential, paranormal phenomena out in its actual location. Back out in the haunted houses, back out where people can sit in their room and take ESP tests till the cows come home. And in addition to that, we want to train people in using Mesa, which is still a technical tool, right? I mean, Annalisa, you've probably meddled with it a bit, because it is collecting up to 7 different ambient environmental variables at 5 samples a second, right? And creating aggregations of all of those, and while connecting those to photos and procedures for baselining, places that you're going. So right now we're kind of working on how we can create accessible education for using it without people throwing it out a window and going, "This is too much work." And I think that's part of the balance in parapsychologists and psychologists reaching lay people, which is, we want that higher quality data, right? And with that, unfortunately, always comes a higher amount of work. So we're trying, I'm working, as much as I can, to fine tune that as much as possible, so that it's as easy as possible. Right, you're still probably going to need someone like Jim or I to do the final analysis on data sets like that, but we're working on basically creating more opportunities for automating citizen science. Was that
And how do people find your app?
The app right now is available on isranet.org, and that's actually the easiest way to do it. Now, it only works on Androids, because I can't cross code into Apple right now, because that's a hot mess and a different coding language. Um, but right now, if you go to Israel, there is a page dedicated to Mesa. So if you go to it on your phone, it'll take you immediately to the Google Play page, right, where you can download the app and fiddle with it. But I will say, the app is at least quasi user friendly, but like most things, like Photoshop, or maybe even using AirMeet for the first time,
Mhm.
if you're expecting it to be the magical ghost hunting tool that gives you all this magical data with no effort, and here it is, it's not that simple. It's
Yeah,
something you have to get used to.
there's a learning curve.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you like that little dig there? Did you like that little dig
I
there,
did
Annalisa?
really enjoy that
Yeah.
detail.
Are there any questions, though?
There
Certainly, I think
are.
we're going to hang out afterwards, but happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, I have a couple here. This one, very specific. Uh,
Okay.
Catherine Pringle asks, what was the process for item writing? Reliability is only as good as the test item.
Oh, I
Oh,
love
well.
it. Someone after my heart. This is a psychometrician asking this question. And in fact, there's actually a set of professional testing standards. If you're going to build any kind of an assessment, questionnaire, survey, there's a process, a set of standards that you're supposed to go through. We follow that process, and I want you to go to our article. It's a 2-part article that was published in Journal of Parapsychology. But you look at items from different points of view. Some of them just for face validity. You get input on content from witnesses, other people on the research team. You do readability analysis to make sure that it's simple enough that people can understand it. And then you also can do some psychometric analysis to know whether people are disproportionately over endorsing or under endorsing certain questions, or if they're giving biased responses. What I'm proud about the Survey of Strange Events is it is a robust psychometric tool. It is unbiased. In other words, people's answers are not skewed because of age, gender, where they are in the world. It is a good psychometric tool. In fact, I sort of lament the fact that in parapsychology, for as much as its innovation is in methods, it has not kept up with modern test theory and the psychometrics of today. But that's a
Jim, I
great question.
Jim, I want to also add, I remember those days when we were crafting this scale and we were in rigorous debate across all of the authors about items, how they should be worded, additional items that should be added, items that weren't appropriate because they didn't, represent the experience of people having haunting experiences. So before we even went through all of this math, there was a lot of clashing and meeting of the minds in,
Oh yeah, there's like
creating,
this expert panel, right?
yeah, and
Exactly.
creating the original test bank that we worked
Yeah.
from.
So, since we're digging into each other, I'm going to go ahead and show this one on stage. Mike Boa says, Jim, you aren't talking like a skeptic. How do you respond to
Yes, yes, I'm winning, Jim.
Well,
I'm winning.
for one, there's a difference between skeptic and debunker, and we as scientists should be skeptical. That's our job. We are supposed to be following data where it leads, not where we want it to lead. We're not supposed to be torturing the witness to confess to whatever we want. We're supposed to require evidence for our conclusions, not try to find evidence for our predetermined conclusions. So I, again, wear skeptic as a badge of honor. It's not a dirty word. It's been, however, bastardized, I would say. And what this person's probably talking about, I know they meant that as a compliment, I hope. I'm not a debunker. I'm very open-minded. I'm the first one that would say, remember, I'm a 7-year-old. I was 7 when I saw that image of the ghost. I want to see that. I want to know if there's something real to that. And there is a part of me that, absolutely wants there to be something parapsychological. I think that'd be fascinating.
And I would also like to add to that, and I'm going to riff as a believer that there is, and I'm even going to use the word sin, right? One of the powerful findings from our article reviewing all the actual environmental studies that have been conducted, right, with regards to hauntings, because if I had $1 for every time someone without a scientific background would make some absolutist claim about infrasound, right? Well, the hauntings infrasound. The studies are not consistent, and there's not many of them. We need both believers and skeptics to absolutely stop making absolutist claims. There is no such thing in science, and anyone that's doing it, in my opinion, Jim does not have to agree with me on this, is violating science, right? We're not supposed to ever make 100% claim because the very nature of existence and the science we have says we can't do it. So I'm getting I'm becoming shocked as I dig more into the mainstream literature, how little actual evidence there has been for some of these absolutist claims of the paranormal can't happen. It's infrasound, right? It's lighting levels. Well, guess what? Not enough data to make that claim. And I'm not saying it's not necessarily valid. What I'm saying is we all need to work a lot more on putting our money where our mouth is.
We take these experiences seriously, but we don't take them at face value. That's a great summary.
So, speaking of experiences, we have one last question.
Okay.
Regarding psychological influences, does a paranormal belief precede an experience, or is it a reaction to an experience?
That is a question that's actually been answered to some extent through empirical research. How do I say this? All things being equal, belief precedes experience. However, there is a mutual reinforcing effect there as well. And I can send information to people, but I think the data are quite clear on this. You can certainly have people that had an experience, maybe they were lukewarm or whatever, but by and large, for someone to have a paranormal experience, they have to have paranormal belief. Otherwise, they might have a weird experience, but it won't be paranormal. Weird things happen all the time, whether you call it paranormal or not. Now we're getting into metaphysics.
Well, but we're not, because generally in social science, right, we have a very firm understanding that beliefs will tend to win out over evidence, data, or experience regardless. Now, there are rare cognitive dissonance situations where that can get reversed, but generally speaking, whether we're talking about the paranormal or the experience of a haunting or not, people's beliefs very much trump experience if that belief is ingrained and relied upon as a part of a person's social identity or reference set for making sense of the world.
But making sense of the world, now you're talking metaphysics. But
no.
fact is that belief is primary, but that doesn't mean it's delusional. I mean, belief also could have something to do with how in tune someone is to the environment. Are they paying attention? How much credence do they give to unusual, ambiguous events? So it doesn't mean that just because you have paranormal belief that precedes an experience, that means therefore it was imagination. That would be the wrong conclusion. But I think the jury has come back, pending more data. I think all the mathematical data shows belief precedes experience.
Okay, great. So I think what we're going to do now is break it to the social lounge. And I think you guys still have a few minutes in you, I hope. And so the social lounge is a space with virtual tables where we can get into some small group discussion in a more intimate way without the recording or the stage. And I love the conversations that happen in the social lounge. So we're going to close this session, and I hope you guys will stick around at least for a little while. The session was supposed to end in about 5 minutes, but I'm happy to keep.
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. I'm happy to keep the
Guilty as
lounge
charged.
open for as long as people are using it. So we will see you in the lounge in a few minutes. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you for your support of public parapsychology.